Today, we're jumping right into a huge debate happening in Japan. And this one, it gets to the very heart of retirement security. We're talking about a massive clash between two totally different ways of thinking about the future. One that's all about social solidarity, and another that's built on individual responsibility.
So, let's start with the number that's causing this whole crisis. By 2050, for every single retiree in Japan, there are only going to be about 1.3 active workers paying into the pension system. Just to give you some perspective on that, a generation ago, that ratio was more like 9 workers for every 1 retiree. That is a massive, massive shift.
You know, this demographic cliff, it isn't just a random statistic. It's a direct threat to the country's entire social contract. And it forces everyone to ask a really tough, really urgent question. What on earth do you do when the math just doesn't work anymore?
This new reality has put Japan at a major crossroads, with 2 very different paths it could take. So first, let's get our heads around the system they have right now, and then we'll look at the pretty radical alternative that's being put on the table. Okay, so Japan's current model is what's called a pay-as-you-go system. The easiest way to think about it is like a conveyor belt. Money comes in from all the people working today on one end, and it goes straight out the other end to pay for today's retirees. The whole thing is built on this idea of generational solidarity. Now, the proposed alternative is a funded system, and this is a completely different beast. Forget the conveyor belt. Instead, imagine that every single person has their own personal savings pot. You put money into your own pot, that money gets invested, and hopefully it grows, and that's what you live on when you retire. This system, it's all about individual responsibility.
So there you have it, 2 completely different philosophies. The current system is all about generational support, which makes it incredibly vulnerable to, well, demographics. The proposed system is based on individual savings, which makes it super vulnerable to the whims of the stock market. And that, right there, is the fundamental trade-off.
So you might be asking, why would anyone push for such a radical change? Well, the people who support it, they argue the current system isn't just flawed, they believe it's broken beyond repair. And their entire case is really built on one powerful idea.
Their core claim is actually pretty simple. The pay-as-you-go system is on a collision course with reality. For them, it's not a question of if it's going to fail, but when.
And, the numbers they use paint a really stark picture. Japan's elderly population is already around 30%, and it's projected to hit 40% by 2060. So payouts are going up, while the number of people paying in is going down. The government is already having to use taxpayer money just to plug the holes, and that's putting a huge strain on the entire national budget. Supporters of change basically see a system that's already on life support.
So what's their big solution? The funded system. The logic is that by tying each person's retirement to their own personal savings, the whole system becomes independent of birth rates. Your financial security in old age would depend on how the market performs, not on how many kids the next generation decides to have.
Okay, but switching entire systems isn't nearly that simple. The arguments against making this kind of radical change are just as powerful, and they start with a massive, very practical problem.
The single biggest obstacle is what opponents call the double burden. And believe me, this is probably the most powerful argument against making a switch, because it affects an entire generation of working people.
So here's what that actually means. If they decided to switch systems, today's workers would have to do 2 things at the same time. First, they'd have to keep paying into the old system to support their parents and grandparents, but second, they'd also have to start saving for their own retirement in the new system. You're basically paying for 2 pensions at once.
And if the double burden wasn't a big enough hurdle, there's a second major argument against this change, and it's all about risk. Opponents argue that a funded system basically privatizes retirement security. It turns what was a social guarantee into a personal gamble on the crazy, unpredictable swings of the financial markets.
And this introduces some really serious vulnerabilities. I mean, imagine a huge market crash right before you're supposed to retire. It could just decimate your life savings. And what about the nearly 40% of Japan's workforce who are non-regular workers? They often don't make enough to save adequately in the first place. A funded system could just make inequality in old age way, way worse.
All right, so we've heard both sides, but the debate gets really interesting when they start responding directly to each other's points. This is where you can really see the core conflict come into focus.
At its heart, this whole debate is a choice between 2 very different kinds of risk. The risk of the current system is a slow, predictable demographic decline. The risk of the new system, on the other hand, is sudden, unpredictable market volatility. One is like a slow-moving train you can see coming from miles away. The other is like a lightning strike you can't see coming at all.
So the people in favor of the funded system, they like to point to other countries. They ask, hey, look at Sweden. They made a similar switch. And yeah, it took them 50 years, but they did it. So why can't we just manage the transition costs over a long period too?
But opponents have a really powerful counterargument to that. When Sweden started its transition back in the 90s, its government debt was only about 20% of its GDP. Japan's debt today? It's over 260%. Their argument is that Japan is just in way too weak of a financial position to even think about affording such a costly transition right now.
And then, to really hammer home the point about market risk, the opponents of change bring up a very recent and very painful example. They point to Japan's own government pension investment fund, the GPIF, which manages the current pension reserves. In 2022 alone, it posted a loss of nearly 1 trillion yen. Their question is simple. Do you really want your personal retirement to be tied to that kind of volatility?
But, of course, the pro-change side has an answer ready. They say that looking at a single bad year is totally misleading. They'll tell you that over the past 20 years, the GPIF's average annual return has actually been over 4%. Their message is clear. Don't panic over the short-term dips. In the long run, investing works.
So after all of that back and forth, it's pretty clear there are no easy answers. This isn't a debate with a simple right or wrong side. It really just boils down to a fundamental choice about what kind of risk a society is willing to take on.
So here's the final trade-off, all laid out. Do you stick with social solidarity and accept that slow, predictable demographic decline where the real burden falls on future generations? Or do you shift to individual responsibility, accepting unpredictable market risk where the burden falls squarely on the one generation that has to manage the transition? And that's really the question at the heart of this entire national debate. Which is the greater threat to Japan's future? A slow, predictable decline that you know is coming, or a volatile, unpredictable market that could change everything overnight?